Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
For context, I'm a 24-year-old woman, and at the time, I was working a late shift at an office building downtown. My job sometimes required me to stay until midnight, and the building would mostly empty out by 7 p.m. The break room was on the second floor, and there was a small vending machine alcove just outside of it. It wasn't visible from the hallway, and you had to turn a corner to get to it. I usually avoided it because it felt so isolated, but one night, my stomach was growling, and I was craving something salty. It was almost 11 p.m., and the building was dead silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I walked to the vending machines, rounded the corner, and froze. There was a man standing there. He wasn't an employee, at least not one I'd ever seen before, and something about him felt off. He wasn't looking at the vending machines or even at me. He was standing with his back against the wall, staring down the hallway I'd just come from, like he was waiting for someone. Hi, I said, trying to act casual. He turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and he didn't say anything, just stared. I nervously laughed and walked to the vending machine, trying to pretend like he wasn't creeping me out. I fumbled with the buttons, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even pick what I wanted. All the while, I could feel his eyes on me. "You shouldn't be here this late," he finally said, his voice low and almost monotone. I glanced at him, trying to gauge if he was dangerous or just socially awkward. "I work here," I said, forcing a smile. "I just needed a snack." He tilted his head, like he didn't believe me. "No one works this late," he said. "Not really." "Okay." That was my cue to leave. "Have a good night," I said, grabbing my bag and turning back toward the hallway. As I started to walk away, I heard him mutter something, but I couldn't make out the words. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was still standing there, staring at me. I hurried back to my office, locked the door, and called security. They came up to check, but by the time they got there, the guy was gone. There was no record of anyone signing in or being on the cameras in that area, which only made the whole thing creepier. I ended up quitting that job a few weeks later, partly because of that encounter and partly because I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few weeks after I quit, I started having these strange moments where I felt like I was being followed. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia from the vending machine incident. I mean, who wouldn't be a little jumpy after something like that? But then, the feeling got stronger. One day, I was at the grocery store, standing in the checkout line, when I saw someone out of the corner of my eye. He was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie. He wasn't looking at me, but he was standing way too still, like he was trying not to draw attention. I turned to get a better look, but he was gone. It was probably just my imagination, or so I tried to convince myself. But over the next few days, I kept seeing him. Once outside my apartment building, just standing by a lamppost. Another time in the parking lot of a coffee shop, watching from across the street. He always seemed to vanish the moment I tried to focus on him, like a shadow slipping away. Then, one night, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a soft tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the second floor, so my first thought was that it must have been a branch or some animal. But when I looked, I saw the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass. I screamed and grabbed my phone to call 911, but by the time I turned back to the window, the face was gone. The police came and looked around but didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. They said it was probably a prank, maybe some neighborhood kid messing around. But deep down, I knew it was After that, I started staying with a friend. I couldn't handle being alone in my apartment, especially at night. I installed new locks, got security cameras, even bought pepper spray, but I never felt safe. The man seemed to disappear after that night, but I could never shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I have no idea who he was or why he targeted me. Was it random? Did I do something to catch his attention that night in the vending machine room? Or had he been watching me long before that? I've moved twice since then, and I've tried to put it all behind me, but every once in a while, I'll catch a glimpse of someone in a crowd or hear an unexpected noise late at night, and my heart will race, wondering if he's finally come back. I hope he hasn't. Life eventually settled into a new rhythm, and the unsettling memories of the vending machine man began to fade, though they never disappeared entirely. I took extra precautions everywhere I went, always double-checking locks and watching my surroundings. I never stayed out late anymore, and I avoided isolated places like the plague. About a year later, I had almost convinced myself that it was over. Maybe it had just been a string of random, unconnected events that my mind had stitched into something bigger. I was starting to feel feel normal again, or at least as normal as one could feel after something like that. Then, one night, it happened again. I was driving home from dinner with friends. It was late, but the streets were well lit, and I hadn't felt the creeping unease I usually got when I was out after dark. I pulled into my apartment complex and parked my car in my usual spot. As I was gathering my things from the passenger seat, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a neighbor walking by, but the figure wasn't moving toward any of the buildings. They were just standing there. I froze, my hand halfway to the door handle. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie. Even in the dim light of the parking lot, I could tell they were staring directly at my car. My stomach dropped. It was him. It had to be. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my bag, and the last thing I wanted was to make a sudden move. I decided to wait him out, hoping he'd lose interest and leave. But he didn't. He just stood there, completely still, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to grab my phone and call 911. As I fumbled with it, the figure suddenly started walking, slowly, deliberately, toward my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I locked the doors and pressed myself back against the seat, praying he would go away. When he reached my car, he stopped right outside the driver's side window. His face was obscured by the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, piercing through the glass. He didn't say anything, didn't try to open the door. He just stood there as if he was savoring the moment. The dispatcher's voice crackled in my ear, pulling me out of my frozen state. I quickly explained what was happening, and they assured me that officers were on their way. But I couldn't wait. The man began tapping on the window, a slow, rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. Then he leaned in closer, and I swear I heard him whisper, "I told you, you shouldn't be here." That was it. I started my car and reversed out of the parking spot so fast that I almost hit the car behind me. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as I sped away. I drove to the nearest police station and waited there until they sent someone to check my apartment. They didn't find anyone, but I refused to go back that night. I stayed at a hotel instead and spent the entire night replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't locked my doors. The next day, I broke my lease. I didn't even bother going back to pack most of my things. I hired a moving company to do it for me. I moved to a new city, changed my phone number, and even started using a different name on social media. It's been 3 years since that night, and I haven't seen him again. But sometimes, when I'm walking to my car or sitting alone in my apartment, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to show up again. I live in a pretty quiet town in the Midwest, and the stretch of road leading to my neighborhood is long, winding, and surrounded by dense forest. It's one of those roads where your headlights are the only source of light, and every shadow seems alive. That night, I was coming back from visiting a friend who lived 2 towns over. It was around 1 a.m., and I hadn't seen another car for miles. I had the radio on low, more for company than anything else, and my windows were cracked to let in the cool night air. About halfway home, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They appeared out of nowhere, coming up fast behind me. At first, I thought it was someone in a hurry, but as the car got closer, it slowed down and kept an unsettlingly even pace behind me. I figured they might be trying to pass, so I moved slightly to the side, but they didn't budge. The car stayed right on my tail, uncomfortably close. It was an old, beat-up sedan, dark, maybe black or navy blue, and its headlights seemed almost too bright, like they'd been tampered with. I tried to shake it off as some jerk trying to mess with me. I accelerated a little, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car matched my speed perfectly. Every twist and turn of the road, they stayed right there, unwavering. The tension started to build. My grip tightened on the wheel, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just some impatient driver anymore. It felt personal. I decided I'd turn off onto a side road, one I knew led back to the main highway eventually, just to see if they'd follow. As soon as I made the turn, they followed. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to lead them to my neighborhood, so I kept driving, taking random turns, trying to lose them. Each time, they mirrored my movements exactly. Then, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of a gas station. It was closed, but the parking lot was well lit. I decided to pull in, hoping they'd drive past or at least hesitate. As I turned into the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and the car was gone. I mean, God, 1 second they were there, their headlights glaring into my car, and the next, the road behind me was empty. I stopped the car, my chest heaving with panic, and scanned the area. There was no sight of them, no taillights, no sound of an engine retreating into the night. Nothing. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to rationalize what had just happened happened. Maybe they turned off when I wasn't looking, though that seemed impossible given how close they'd been. Finally, I mustered the courage to drive home, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting them to reappear. But they didn't. When I got home, I locked every door and window, then sat in the dark with a baseball bat, jumping at every noise. I never saw that car again, but I still avoid driving that road at night. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I got in my car, I found myself compulsively checking my mirrors, half expecting those blinding headlights to appear again. I even considered talking to someone about what happened, but I didn't want to sound crazy. After all, how do you explain a car that just vanishes? One night, about a month later, I was hanging out at a friend's house. We were swapping spooky stories, mostly dumb urban legends, when I casually mentioned the car. The room went quiet. My friend Nick, who grew up in the same town, looked at me with a strange expression. "Wait," he said, "where exactly were you when that happened?" I described the stretch of road, and his face went pale. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck like he didn't want to tell me what he was thinking. "You're not gonna like this," he said, "but there's this story people used to tell in high school. They say there was a guy, like, decades ago, who would drive that road late at night looking for people to mess with. He'd tailgate them, freak them out, sometimes even run them off the road. Supposedly, one night he picked a wrong car. He ended up in a wreck, died instantly. His car got totaled, but, like, people swear they've seen it since." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Come on, that's just a dumb ghost story." Nick shrugged, "But my cousin swears he saw it once. Same thing you described, a beat-up old car with those blinding lights. He said it followed him all the way to the edge of town and then just disappeared." I didn't sleep well that night. As much as I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, or maybe even my mind playing tricks on me, the details were too specific. And the more I thought about it, the more little things started to add up. Like how the headlights seemed impossibly bright, almost unnatural, or how the car matched every turn I made, as if it knew where I was going. And then there was the eerie silence when it disappeared. No sound of tires on gravel, no hum of an engine fading into the distance. Just nothing. The final straw came a couple of weeks later. I was cleaning out my car when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faint smear of dirt on my back bumper, shaped almost like a handprint. It wasn't there before, and I couldn't think of any reason it would be now. It was as if someone, or something, had reached out and touched my car that night. I've avoided that road ever since. If I have to drive anywhere late at night, I take the long way around, even if it adds half an hour to my trip. And every time I pass that turnoff, I feel a chill run down my spine. A few months passed, and while I avoided that road, the experience never fully left me. Little things would trigger my anxiety, bright headlights at my rearview mirror, the sound of tires crunching gravel, even the thought of driving at night. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every now and then, the memories crept back in. Then one night, it happened again. I was coming home late from work. It was winter, and the sun had set hours earlier. My usual route was blocked due to an accident, so I had no choice but to take the long, windy road I'd been avoiding. My stomach churned as I turned onto it, the dark trees towering on either side like walls. I kept telling myself it was fine. It was just a road. Nothing would happen. The odds of encountering that car again were astronomically low. Right about halfway down the stretch, my radio started to crackle. Static interrupted the music, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't stop. Then the headlights appeared. At first, they were faint in the distance, but as I glanced into my rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. It was the same car. The beat-up sedan with its blindingly bright headlights was back, barely toward me like it had been waiting for this moment. My hands gripped the wheel as I felt my heart leap into my throat. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just another driver, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. As before, the car sped up until it was right on my bumper, its lights glaring into my car like twin suns. This time, I wasn't going to let it intimidate me. I floored the gas, determined to outrun it. My car roared as it surged forward, but the sedan kept pace effortlessly. Every turn I took, every maneuver I tried to lose it, the car stayed glued to my tail. Then, the headlights flickered. For a split second, they blinked out, plunging the road behind me into darkness. When they came back, the car was closer, impossibly so, as if it had gained several feet in an instant. My panic surged. It wasn't just following me, it was toying with me. Desperate, I decided to head toward the nearest populated area, a small gas station a few miles down the road. I knew it was risky. The last time I tried this, the car had vanished, but I needed to do something. As I approached the station, the car behind me did something that made my blood freeze. Its horn blared. Not a normal car horn, but this long, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire forest. It was distorted, almost unnatural, like a scream filtered through static. When I pulled into the gas station's lot, I slammed on my brakes and whipped my car around to face the road. But the sedan wasn't there. Just like before, it had vanished. The road was empty, the forest silent. I sat there, trembling, staring at the empty stretch of asphalt. The gas station was closed. forest, and the lights inside flickered weakly. For a moment, I debated calling anyone, to come get me, but who would believe me? I didn't even fully believe it myself. Then I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, just barely illuminated by my taillights. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away as possible. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I slammed my car into reverse, then sped out of the lot and back toward town. I didn't look back, not once. When I got home, I parked my car in the garage, locked every door and window, and sat in the dark with my phone clutched in my hand. I debated calling the police but couldn't bring myself to do it. What could I even say? That was the last time I saw the car or the figure, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that horn, that impossible sound that still echoes in my mind, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it to the gas station, to the driver of the beat-up sedan, or whatever was waiting for me in the forest. Let's not meet. Not in this life. Not in any life. I was living in a mid-sized city, working late nights at a job downtown. My apartment was a few blocks away, but the streets were sketchy after dark, so I always parked in the same multi-level garage near my building. It wasn't ideal, it was dimly lit, mostly empty at night, and the elevators always seemed to smell like mildew. But it was better than walking alone on the street. One night, I stayed at work later than usual. By the time I left, it was well past 1 a.m. The streets were eerily quiet, and I felt the usual unease as I made my way to the garage. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to shake off the chill in the air and the feeling of being watched. When I entered the garage, I noticed it was emptier than usual. My car was on the 3rd level, so I took the stairs up, not wanting to risk the sketchy elevator. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't hurried, but they weren't casual either, measured, deliberate steps echoing in the empty space. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man a few feet behind me. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. I couldn't make out his face, but something about him set off alarm bells in my head. I quickened my pace, and so did he. My heart started racing. I reached my car, fumbling with my keys, when I heard him speak. "Hey, miss, you dropped something." I turned slightly, keeping my distance, and saw him holding out a piece of paper. I didn't remember dropping anything, but maybe I had. Maybe this was innocent. But his posture was off, too casual, like he was trying to seem non-threatening. Something in my gut told me to keep my distance. "No, I didn't. Thanks," I said quickly, getting into my car and locking the doors. He just stood there, staring at me through the window, the paper still in his hand. Then he said, "Are you sure? Why don't you just come check?" I started my car, my hands trembling. "No, I'm fine," I said, louder this time, hoping to sound braver than I felt. That's when he dropped the paper and lunged at my car, yanking on the door handle. Thank God I'd locked it. He started pounding on the window, shouting something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own heartbeat. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of there as fast as I could, nearly hitting a pillar on my way out. When I got home, I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone to call the police. They took my statement and said they'd send someone to check the garage, but I never heard back about it. I started parking somewhere else after that, even if it meant a longer walk home. A few days later, I found myself replaying the incident in my head, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe he'd been a harmless guy who just came off the wrong way. But deep down, I knew better. That feeling in my gut hadn't come out of nowhere. Then, something happened that solidified my fears. I was leaving work again, though this time I made sure it wasn't so late. Just after 9 p.m. the streets were busier, and I felt a little more at ease. Still, as I approached the new parking lot I'd chosen, I noticed a figure leaning against a lamp post across the street. It was him. The same hoodie, the same posture, and the same unsettling stillness. I froze, pretending to fumble with my phone, hoping he hadn't noticed me. But when I glanced up, he was staring right at me. My stomach dropped. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smirk that made my skin crawl, and then he started walking toward me. I didn't even think. I turned and bolted back toward my office, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I reached the lobby and quickly told the security guard what had happened. He walked me to the employee break room and called the police. When they arrived, I described the man and told them what had happened a few nights prior. They took my report seriously this time and promised to increase patrols in the area. I appreciated it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't catch him. He sounded calculated. For weeks, I took extra precautions. I stopped going anywhere alone, carried pepper spray, and even considered changing jobs just to avoid being downtown. I never saw him again, but the paranoia lingered. Every time I entered a parking lot, my heart raced, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Months later, I got a call from the police. They wanted to let me know that they'd arrested someone who matched the description I gave them. He'd been caught trying to lure a woman into his car with the same "you dropped something" trick. But this time, she hadn't been as lucky. The details of what he did to her so haunt me. I was relieved he was off the streets, but I couldn't help feeling a heavy sense of guilt and dread. What if I'd reported him sooner? What if I'd been more persistent? That poor woman, to anyone reading this, always trust your gut. It's better to be overly cautious than to regret giving someone the benefit of the doubt. After hearing the news, I tried to move on. I told myself he was in custody, that he couldn't hurt me or anyone else anymore. But the fear didn't just disappear. Every sound of the dark seemed louder, every shadow seemed to move, and the sense of being watched never fully went away. A few months passed, and I started to regain a sense of normalcy. I even began parking in the new lot without feeling like I needed to sprint to my car every night. Life was settling down, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. Until one night, it was a Friday, and I'd gone out with a few coworkers after work. We stayed at the bar until closing, and by the time I headed to my car, it was around 2 a.m. The streets were eerily quiet, and the buzz of the alcohol was wearing off, leaving me with that familiar unease. I walked briskly, clutching my keys tightly between my fingers, a habit I'd never shaken. When I reached my car, everything seemed fine. I glanced around the lot and didn't see anyone, but as I unlocked my door and got inside, I noticed something on the windshield, a folded piece of paper tucked under the wiper. My stomach twisted. I didn't dare get out to grab it. Instead, I locked the doors, started the car, and drove a few blocks to a well-lit gas station before pulling over to check. My hands were trembling as I stepped out and grabbed the note. In large, scrawled handwriting, it said, Vespe. My blood ran cold. My vision blurred as panic set in. It couldn't be him. The police said he was in custody. They said he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. But how else could this note be explained? I didn't wait around to analyze it. I jumped back in my car and drove straight to the nearest police station, clutching the paper the entire way. The officers took me seriously, though their reassurances didn't calm me. They told me it was possible someone else had left the note, a sick joke by someone who'd read the news about his arrest. But I knew it was him. The next day, they confirmed my worst fear. The man had been released on a technicality, some mishandled evidence or legal loophole. I didn't care about the details. All I knew was that he was free and he'd found me. That week, I moved out of the city. I quit my job, broke my lease, and left everything behind. I couldn't sleep knowing he was still out there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. It's been years now, and I still jump at shadows. I've changed my name, my appearance, and my routine more times than I can count. I live in a small town now, far from where it all started. Most days, I feel safe, but every so often, I'll see a car that looks like his, or hear footsteps behind me, and my chest tightens. I used to work the closing shift at a 24-hour grocery store in my small hometown. It wasn't a particularly exciting job, but I didn't mind the quiet hours. Most nights, the store was nearly empty, save for a few late-night shoppers grabbing last-minute items. I liked the solitude until the night I didn't. It was a Thursday, and the store had been dead all evening. By 11:30 p.m., there was just me, my coworker Maria, and the overnight stock guy, Kevin. Maria was in the back counting tills, and Kevin was somewhere in the warehouse prepping pallets. I was alone at the register, scrolling on my phone when the automatic doors whooshed open. A woman walked in, her head down, wearing a hoodie pulled up so I couldn't see her face. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of people wanted to stay anonymous during late night shopping trips. What was strange was her pacing. She didn't grab a cart or a basket, and she wasn't looking at anything on the shelves. Instead, she just wandered up and down the aisles, her hands in her pockets, occasionally glancing over at me. I tried not to let it bother me. People are weird sometimes, right? Maybe she was just killing time or waiting for someone, but something about the way she moved felt off. Her steps were too deliberate, like she was walking a route she'd rehearsed. After about 15 minutes of this, Maria came out from the back with the cash drops. She immediately noticed my discomfort. "You okay?" she whispered, glancing toward the woman in the produce section. "I don't know," I said, keeping my voice low. "She's just been wandering around. She hasn't bought anything." Maria frowned but shrugged. "Probably nothing. Just keep an eye on her." The woman must have overheard us, because she abruptly left the produce section and started heading toward the exit. I felt a wave of relief as the doors opened and closed behind her, but the relief didn't last. Less than 5 minutes later, the automatic doors opened again. This time, a man walked in. He was tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't grab a cart either. Instead, he walked straight past me toward the back of the store where Maria had gone to finish her tasks. Something about him set me on edge. Maybe it was the way he didn't even glance at the shelves or how he walked with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. My stomach twisted when I realized realized he wasn't just heading to the back, he was following the same path the woman had paced earlier. I grabbed the phone and paged Kevin over the intercom, trying to sound casual. "Kevin, can you come to the front, please?" No response. I paged again. Still nothing. The store was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes your heart race. I decided I wasn't waiting around for something bad to happen. I walked quickly to the back, calling out for Maria as I went. When I found her in the office, I blurted, "There's a guy out here. I think he's following the same route as that woman earlier. Something's wrong." Maria's face paled, but she stayed calm. "Let's check the cameras." We pulled up the live feed, and there they were, the man and the woman together now. They were standing in one of the darker aisles, heads close together, clearly whispering. And then, as if they sensed they were being watched, both of them turned and looked directly into the camera. I swear they knew. Maria didn't hesitate. She grabbed the phone and called the police, describing the situation as calmly as she could. Meanwhile, I kept my eyes on the cameras. The pair started moving again, this time heading straight for the back door near the warehouse. "Kevin's back there," I said, panic rising. We ran to the warehouse just as the pair slipped out through the emergency exit. Kevin was fine, thankfully, though he looked confused and a little freaked out when we told him what happened. The police arrived quickly and searched the area but didn't find anyone. They took our statements and reviewed the camera footage, promising to follow up. But they never caught the pair, and as far as I know, they never even figured out what the two were planning. I quit that job not long after. After quitting that job, I thought I'd feel a sense of relief. Instead, I found myself more paranoid than ever. Every time I walked into a store or down a quiet street, I'd catch myself scanning my surroundings, watching for anyone who seemed out of place. I told myself it was just lingering nerves, but deep down, I knew better. A couple of weeks after I left, Maria called me. "You're not gonna believe this," she said, her voice shaky. "I got a call from the police today. They think they know who those people were." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Did they find them?" "Not exactly," she replied, "but they've been investigating a string of burglaries in the area. It turns out that grocery stores, especially ones open late, are being targeted as part of some bigger operation. The suspects scope out the layout, figure out security blind spots, and then hit the place after hours. They think that's what those two were doing." My mind raced. But why were they so focused on us? Why didn't they just come back later to rob the place? Maria hesitated. "That's the thing. They don't think the store was the main target. Apparently, there's been a pattern of employees being followed home after late shifts, stalked, threatened, and even attacked. They think the woman was marking you, and the man was supposed to, I don't know, follow through with something." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The idea that I might have been the real target, that they might have been planning to follow me home, made my skin crawl. My little one-bedroom apartment had always felt like a safe haven. Now, the thought of it made me feel vulnerable and exposed. "Are they watching the store now?" I asked. "Yeah," Maria said. "They've increased patrols in the area and told us to be extra cautious. But they still haven't found them." I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside made my heart pound. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, but it didn't help. I felt like they could be anywhere, waiting, watching. A few days later, I noticed something strange. I was walking home from my new job at a coffee shop, and I had this nagging feeling that someone was behind me. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but when I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of someone, a figure in a hoodie, ducking into an alleyway. My chest tightened. I didn't want to seem crazy, so I kept walking, but my pace quickened, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. By the time I got to my apartment building, I was practically running. I fumbled with my keys, got inside, and bolted the door behind me. I checked the peephole, but didn't see anyone. The next morning, I found a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was blank, except for a single word scrawled in messy handwriting. Soon, that was it. I packed up my things that day and moved in with my sister in a different town. I didn't care about breaking my lease or explaining myself to my landlord. My safety was worth more than anything else. I've never seen or heard from those people again, but the experience changed me forever. I don't go anywhere without letting someone know where I'll be, and I always carry pepper spray in my bag. Moving in with my sister gave me some sense of security, but the fear lingered. For a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in a new town miles away. Every time I went out, I scanned the streets, parked in well-lit areas, and avoided walking alone at night. My sister tried to reassure me, telling me it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe her. About 3 months after I moved in, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety I had managed to build. My sister and I were out running errands one evening, and we stopped at a grocery store. It was a different chain from the one where I used to work, but it still gave me an odd sense of deja vu. I kept close to her, clutching my bag tightly. As we wandered through the aisles, I spotted a man at the other end of the store. He was tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was looking at a display of canned goods, but something about his posture caught my attention. My heart started racing. "No," I muttered under my breath. Yes, it can't be. What's wrong? My sister asked, noticing the panic on my face. I didn't want to alarm her, so I shook my head. Nothing. I just thought I saw someone I knew. She frowned but let it go. Still, I couldn't stop glancing over at him. He moved with the same deliberate steps I'd seen before, methodical and calm. My stomach churned as he turned and walked toward another aisle, disappearing from view. I tried to tell myself it wasn't him. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when we left the store, I saw him again. He was sitting in a car parked a few spaces away, his head turned toward us. I grabbed my sister's arm and hurried her to our car, locking the doors the moment we got inside. What is going on? She demanded, her voice sharp with concern. I'll explain later, I said, my voice trembling. Just drive. That. She didn't argue. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the side mirror and saw the man's car pull out too. He was following us. Don't go home, I said quickly. Drive somewhere busy. A gas station, a restaurant, anywhere with people. Panic flashed across her face, but she nodded and turned toward a nearby diner. The man's car followed us all the way there, only pulling off when we turned into the well-lit parking lot. I watched him drive past, my heart pounding. Inside the diner, I finally told my sister everything about the strange customers, the message on my car, and the lingering fear I couldn't shake. She didn't call me paranoid or brush it off. Instead, she hugged me tightly and said, we're going to figure this out. The next day, we filed a police report. They took down the details but couldn't do much without concrete evidence. I decided to install cameras around our house and started parking in the garage instead of on the street. I even changed my phone number just in case. Weeks passed and I didn't see the man again. The police never found him and I never got another threatening message. But the experience left me scarred. I still don't know if it was the same man from that night at the grocery store or just someone new who decided to target me. Either way, I wasn't going to take any chances. To the man who followed me and made me feel like prey, you didn't win. I'm still here and I've learned how to protect myself. I was renting a cozy little house on the edge of a nature reserve. It was the kind of place where you knew your neighbors, and we all left our doors unlocked during the day. I never felt unsafe there until this incident. One night, I stayed up late binge watching a new show. It was past midnight, and I was just starting to doze off on the couch when I heard it, a soft tapping on my back door. Not a knock, mind you. It was more like someone lightly drumming their fingertips against the glass. I froze. My back door was one of those older style doors with a big glass window in the middle. The curtains were drawn, so I couldn't see who or what was on the other side. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch or maybe an animal, but then it happened again, more insistent this time. I got up, heart racing, and tiptoed to the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I moved the curtain aside just a fraction and peeked out. There was nothing there. The yard was empty, bathed in the cold glow of the porch light. I let out a shaky breath and decided I was just being paranoid. I double-checked the lock on the door and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something strange. On the outside of the glass, there were smudges. 5 faint, greasy streaks, like someone had pressed their hand against it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe one of the neighbor kids had come by and got spooked when they realized how late it was. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been watching me. A week passed without incident. Then, one evening, I came home to find something new. On the back door, someone had painted a large red X. It wasn't spray paint. It looked like it had been painted with a brush. The lines were clean, deliberate. I called the police, but they didn't find much to go on. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. That night, I barely slept. I stayed on the couch with all the lights on and a baseball bat by my side. At some point in the early morning, I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound I'll never forget, my front door creaking open. I shot up, gripping the bat, and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. I crept to the door, bat raised, and found it wide open. The lock was intact, no signs of damage. It was as if someone had unlocked it with a key. I moved out the next day. The house sat empty for months after that. When I finally mustered the courage to ask my former landlord if they'd found another tenant, they told me something that sent chills down my spine. They'd recently done some renovations and discovered a hidden crawl space under the floorboards in the master bedroom. Inside, they found a pile of cigarette butts, empty food wrappers, and a small mattress. Someone had been living there. I tried to forget about that house and what had happened, but the idea that someone had been living under my floorboards, silently coexisting with me, haunted me. I thought about all the nights I'd heard strange creaks and groans, dismissing them as the house settling, all the times I felt like I was being watched but couldn't find a reason reason why. It made my skin crawl. A couple of months later, I was living in a new place in a different town, trying to move on. But one night, I got a call from an unknown number. I normally wouldn't have answered, but something compelled me to. "Hello," I said. There was a pause on the other end. Then a man's voice, low and scratchy, said, "Why'd you leave?" My stomach dropped. I hung up immediately and blocked the number. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, but deep down, I knew better. I reported it to the police, but they told me there wasn't much they could do. Without evidence or further contact, it was just an anonymous phone call. I tried to convince myself it was over, but it wasn't. A few weeks later, I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep. It didn't have a return address. Stupidly, I brought it inside, thinking it might be from a friend or delivery mix-up. Inside the box was a single item, the same red paper she used to mark my door at the old house. I immediately called the police, but once again, they couldn't do much. There was no fingerprint evidence, no surveillance footage from my new apartment complex. I started to feel like I was going crazy. After that, the little things started happening again. I'd hear fate tapping at my windows late at night. My porch light would flicker even though the bulb was new. Once, I found my front door unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it before bed. The final straw came one night when I was in bed, scrolling on my phone. My bedroom window faced the street, and I always kept the blinds drawn for privacy. But that night, for some reason, I glanced up and saw the silhouette of a person standing just outside. They didn't move. They just stood there, backlit by the street lamp, staring directly at my window. I froze, too scared to even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I grabbed my phone and called 911. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. The officers were kind but skeptical. They said it was probably just a neighbor or someone passing by. But I knew better. I packed up and left town the next morning. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my friends. I moved to a new city under a new lease, changed my phone number, and started locking every door and window obsessively. It's been 2 years now, and I haven't seen or heard anything since. I want to believe I've escaped whoever or whatever it was that had fixated on me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that soft tapping sound in my dreams. Even after 2 years of relative silence, the paranoia never completely left me. I've tried to move on, even started therapy to deal with the lingering anxiety, but I still feel the weight of that time in my life. Every noise of the night sets me on edge. Every unfamiliar face in a crowd makes my stomach churn. I thought I'd finally found peace in my new home. It's a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a well-secured building. My neighbors are friendly but keep to themselves, and I feel safe knowing I'm up high, with a solid front door and a locked entry to the building. But last week, something happened that has me questioning everything. I came home late from work. It was one of those long days where you're so tired you barely remember getting into bed. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I noticed something odd, a small red smudge on the wall next to my door. It was faint, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just paint from someone moving furniture or a maintenance worker who'd brushed up against the wall. I didn't want to overthink it. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself to forget about it. The next morning, I opened my door to head to work and saw something that stopped me cold. On my door frame, near the handle, was another mark, a small red X, this time drawn clearly with what looked like lipstick. I felt sick. I called the building manager, who assured me they'd check the security footage and look into it. I stayed at a friend's place that night, too scared to sleep in my apartment. The next day, the manager called me back. There's nothing on the footage, he said, sounding confused. No one came up to your door last night. Are you sure the mark wasn't already there? I hung up, shaking. I knew it wasn't there before. I knew someone had been outside my door. That evening, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. It was a single piece of paper with just 3 words written on it. You can't hide. I packed a bag and left immediately. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I drove aimlessly for hours, checking into a random motel far from my apartment. The police are involved now, but they found no evidence, no suspects, nothing. I've told them everything, but without proof, they can't do much. I feel like I'm spiraling. How did they find me? How are they getting so close without anyone noticing? I've started to feel like I'm being watched everywhere I go. At the grocery store, in my car, even when I'm inside my motel room. I've started covering the windows, sleeping with the lights on, and keeping a weapon within arm's reach. Last night, I woke up to the sound of fate tapping. This time, it wasn't at a door or window. It was coming from the mirror in the motel bathroom. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. I just grabbed my things and left. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know where to go. To the person or thing that keeps finding me, please, I beg you, let's never meet again. It all started last winter when I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. I had just gotten out of a messy breakup and needed a place to start fresh. The rent for the small, 2-bedroom house was suspiciously low, but the landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Davenport, seemed eager to have someone move in. She mentioned it had been vacant for a while, so I thought I was just lucky. The house itself was cozy, if a bit outdated. The hardwood floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to amplify even the smallest noise. Still, it was mine, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had a space to call home. The first night passed uneventfully, save for a strange, almost rhythmic creaking sound coming from the ceiling. I chalked it up to the old wooden beams settling in the cold. The next day, I unpacked and began to settle into a routine. A few nights later, I was reading in bed when I heard it again, the creaking, but this time it was accompanied by what sounded like faint, deliberate footsteps. My heart raced. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and shone it around the room, half expecting to see a raccoon or some other critter that had somehow gotten in. But there was nothing. The sounds continued, always at night and always in the same pattern: creak, step, pause. It got to the point where I started dreading bedtime, knowing that as soon as the house grew quiet, the noises would begin. One night, I decided I'd had enough. Armed with a baseball bat and my phone, I made my way into the attic. The narrow staircase groaned under my weight as I climbed, each step feeling like it stretched into eternity. The attic door was heavier than I expected, and when I pushed it open, a musty smell hit me. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating dusty boxes and cobwebs. There was no sign of anything living, no animals, no intruders. But as I was about to head back down, something caught my eye: a small, child-sized chair sitting in the corner of the attic. It looked out of place, too clean compared to everything else up there. On the floor next to it was a piece of paper, folded neatly. I hesitated before picking it up. My hand shook as I unfolded it, revealing a crudely drawn picture of a figure standing in front of a house. Scrawled underneath in shaky handwriting were the words, "I live here too." I bolted out of the attic, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. The note clutched in my hand as I sat on the couch, every creak of the house sending chills down my spine. The next morning, I called Mrs. Davenport to demand answers. At first, she was evasive, but when I mentioned the drawing, she sighed heavily. "I didn't want to scare you," she said, her voice trembling, "but the previous tenants left in a hurry. They said they heard things, saw things. I thought it was just their imaginations." That was all I needed to hear. I packed my things and left that same day, forfeiting my deposit. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the window of the house. A few weeks after I moved out, I tried to put the whole ordeal behind me. I found a new apartment in a bustling part of town where the constant noise of the city was a comfort compared to the eerie silence of that old house. Life started to feel normal again, but then things got strange. One morning, I received a package in the mail with no return address. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, and my name was scrawled on the front in handwriting that seemed vaguely familiar. My stomach sank as I opened it. Inside was the same piece of paper I'd found in the attic, the crude drawing of the house and the figure with the words, "I live here too." But now, there was something new added to the picture, a second figure standing next to the first. It was smaller, and it had long lines extending from its head, almost like hair. My breath caught as I realized it resembled me. I called the police immediately. The officer who came to my apartment tried to reassure me, but I could tell he didn't take it seriously. He suggested it might have been a prank by the landlord or even the previous tenants. I wasn't convinced. A week later, I started receiving calls from an unknown number. At first, I didn't answer, but the persistence was unnerving. Finally, I picked up one night, hoping to tell whoever it was to leave me alone. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking. There was silence on the other end, but I could hear faint breathing. Then a soft, childlike voice whispered, "I miss you." I froze, unable to speak, before the line went dead. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I immediately blocked the number, but the calls continued from different ones. I stopped answering altogether, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I was coming home from work, I felt it again, the sensation of eyes on me. I turned around quickly, scanning the street, but there was nothing unusual, just people going about their day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I hurried inside and locked the door. That night, I woke up to a sound that sent chills down my spine, the creak of floorboards, followed by faint footsteps. But I wasn't in that house anymore. I was on the 3rd floor of a secure apartment building. There was no attic here, no old wooden beams. I stayed frozen in bed, straining to hear more. The sound moved closer and closer still until it was right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, gripping my phone and preparing to call the police when the footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, until the morning light streamed through my window. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. But on the floor, right outside my room, was another piece of paper. This one was blank except for 3 words scrawled in the middle: "Found you again." I didn't sleep for days after that. I moved out of the apartment a week later, breaking my lease and going off the grid. grid. I changed my number, stayed with friends, and even considered moving to another state. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever it was would follow me no matter where I went. I haven't had any more incidents since then, but every time I hear the creak of floorboards or feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I can't help but wonder, did I really leave it behind? It's been a year since I went off the grid, but the fear hasn't left me. I've tried everything to keep my life quiet and untraceable. No social media, no forwarding address, a burner phone, anything to keep whatever was haunting me from finding me again. For a while, it seemed like I'd finally escaped. I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was safe. But that was before last week. It started small. I'd moved to a rural area, renting a small cabin in the woods. No neighbors for miles, no one to bother me, and, I thought, no way for anyone to find me. But one evening, as I was sitting by the fireplace reading, I heard a sound outside, a light tapping against the window. My heart leaped into my throat. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. When I finally worked up the courage to check, I saw nothing. No wind, no branches nearby, just the cold, still night. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They weren't boot prints, though they were small, like a child's. They led from the forest edge right up to my window, then disappeared back into the trees. I told myself it must have been a prank, maybe some local kids messing around, but I couldn't shake the gnawing unease. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of tapping again. This time, it wasn't at the window, it was on the cabin door. It was soft at first, like a gentle knock, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the kitchen knife I kept by my bed and crept toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The tapping stopped. I stood there, knife in hand, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the peephole. My stomach dropped. On the porch was a small, child-sized chair, the same chair from the attic of that house. Sitting on it was a piece of paper. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just leave it there, mocking me. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and grabbed the paper, slamming the door shut behind me. This one was different. The drawing showed the cabin now, surrounded by trees. The figure was there too, but this time, it wasn't alone. Next to it stood the second figure, the one that looked like me, but now, a third figure had been added. It was larger than the others, looming over them, with jagged lines that made it look like it was. Smiling underneath the drawing were the words, "We're all together now." I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light in the cabin on and stayed with my back against the wall, clutching the knife until the sun rose. When morning finally came, I packed what little I had and left. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as it was far away. Now, I'm writing this from a motel in the middle of nowhere, the knife still within arm's reach. I don't know what to do anymore. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, it keeps finding me. And I can't help but wonder who or what is the third figure. Is it already with me, waiting for the right moment? Or is it something I haven't met yet? A few years ago, I went on a solo camping trip to a state forest about an hour outside my town. I had just gone through a tough breakup and needed some time alone to clear my head. I wasn't an experienced camper, but I had the basics: tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a small propane stove. I arrived mid-afternoon, found a marked trail, and hiked about 3 miles in before deciding to set up camp near a small, serene lake. There were no other cars in the parking lot when I started my hike, and I didn't see a single soul on the trail. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself. As the sun set, I cooked some dinner and watched the sky turn shades of orange and purple. It was one of those moments where everything feels perfectly peaceful. I zipped myself into my tent a little after dark, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps, these were heavy, deliberate, human steps. My heart started pounding as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe someone else decided to camp nearby, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. Whomever it was, they just stood there. The only thing between us was a thin layer of nylon. I couldn't see their shadow because the moonlight didn't reach through the trees where I had set up camp. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a low, raspy voice say, "You're in my spot." I didn't reply. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. Then the voice spoke again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound of fabric tearing broke the silence as something sharp sliced into the side of my tent. I screamed and scrambled out through the opposite side, running into the woods without my flashlight or shoes. I didn't care which direction I was going, I just needed to get away. As I ran, I heard branches snapping behind me. They were following me. My lungs burned, my feet were be cut up by rocks and twigs, but I didn't dare stop. Eventually, I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my knees and hands. I crouched behind a large fallen tree, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing. When the first hints of dawn appeared, I cautiously made my way back to my campsite. My tent was slashed to ribbons, and my gear was scattered everywhere. But what made my stomach drop was what I found near the remains of my tent: a rusted hunting knife stabbed into the ground, and a crudely carved wooden figurine of a person lying on their side. I didn't take anything with me. I ran back to the trailhead, jumped into my car, and didn't stop driving until I was home. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they didn't find anything except my destroyed tent and some footprints that led off into the forest. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that voice, low, raspy, and unrelenting: "You shouldn't have come here." Every sound of the night made me jump, and I found myself obsessively checking the locks on my doors and windows. The park rangers had been polite but dismissive when I filed my report. They chalked it up to a homeless individual or an overzealous survivalist living off the grid. Still, their lack of concern didn't sit well with me. The figurine, the knife, the way they followed me through the woods, none of it felt random. It felt deliberate. A month after the camping trip, I started noticing small things that felt off. My backyard gate, which I always locked, would be open in the mornings. My dog, a mutt named Daisy, started acting strangely, growling at empty corners of the house and barking incessantly at night. I'd occasionally hear faint knocks at the front door or on the windows late at night, but whenever I checked, no one was there. The worst incident happened about 6 weeks after the camping trip. I came home from work late one evening and found my front door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. My heart sank as I pushed the door open, half expecting someone to jump out at me. The house was quiet, too quiet. Daisy, who usually greeted me at the door with her tail wagging, was nowhere to be seen. I called her name, my voice trembling. A faint whine came from the kitchen. When I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Daisy was there, crouched under the table, trembling. On the kitchen counter was something that made my blood run cold: another wooden figurine, identical to the one I had found at the campsite. It was lying on its side, just like the first one, but this time, the figure had a small red smear on its chest. I grabbed Daisy and ran out of the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I drove to a friend's place and called the police. They searched the house and didn't find anything: no signs of forced entry, no intruder. The figurine, they said, was probably a prank or something I had left there myself. They didn't take me seriously. That was the last straw. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I broke my lease and moved in with my sister for a few months while I figured things out. During that time, the strange occurrences stopped. Daisy seemed to relax, and I finally began to feel a semblance of safety again. But I still think about that night in the woods and everything that followed. Was it all just a coincidence? Some twisted prankster trying to scare me? Or was it something darker, something I'll never fully understand? After a few months of staying with my sister, I finally saved up enough money to move into a new apartment across town. It was smaller, on the second floor of a building with plenty of neighbors close by. I chose it specifically because it felt secure: multiple locks on the doors, windows that didn't face the street, and a fire escape that led to a locked alley. For a while, life started to feel normal again. I got back into my routines and even started seeing a therapist to work through the lingering anxiety and nightmares. Daisy adjusted well to the new place, and her old habits of growling at shadows and barking at night disappeared completely. But then, one evening, it happened again. I came home late after grabbing dinner with some coworkers. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Usually, Daisy would come running to greet me, but she didn't. I called her name, and after a few moments, I heard her whimpering from the bedroom. When I walked in, I found her hiding under the bed, trembling, just like she had that night in the kitchen. My stomach dropped as I turned on the light and saw it: another wooden figurine, placed neatly in the center of my bed. This one was different, though. It was larger, more detailed. The figure was crouched, with its hands covering its face, as if it were weeping. A fresh, red smear was painted across its back. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hand shook as I grabbed Daisy and backed out of the apartment. I called the police from the hallway, trying to stay calm as I explained what had happened. The officers who responded were more thorough this time, and they searched the apartment from top to bottom, checking every window, door, and even the fire escape. There was no sign of forced entry, and all the locks were intact. Once again, they seemed skeptical, suggesting that someone might have a spare key or that I'd somehow brought the figurine in myself. I knew better. This wasn't a prank, and it wasn't random. Whoever had left that figurine had been inside my home. After the police left, I called my sister and spent the night at her place again. I didn't didn't know what else to do. I felt like I was being hunted, like no matter where I went, this person or thing would find me. The next morning, I returned to the apartment to pack some essentials. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. As I was grabbing a suitcase from the closet, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratch marks on the inside of the closet door. They were deep, erratic, as if someone had been clawing at it from the inside. I moved out that same day and never went back. It's been a year since that last incident. I moved to a different state, changed my phone number, and made sure my new address wasn't listed anywhere publicly. I've done everything I can to disappear, to make sure that whatever was following me can't find me again. So far, it's worked, but I still double check every lock before bed, and I keep a bat next to my bed just in case. Every so often, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear footsteps or the faint sound of that raspy voice. I had found a cute little rental cottage on the edge of a vast field. It was idyllic, quiet, surrounded by nature, and with no neighbors in sight except for an old, abandoned house across the field. The house was a classic haunted house type, peeling paint, broken windows, and a saggy roof. I'd heard from my landlord that it had been empty for decades after the last owner passed away. Local kids occasionally dared each other to sneak inside, but mostly people avoided it. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Life got busy, and my evenings were spent unwinding on the porch with a cup of tea, enjoying the peaceful view. It wasn't until about 3 weeks in that I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of the moonlight on the broken windows, but then I realized it was coming from inside the house. It flickered faintly, like a candle or a weak flashlight. I figured it must be kids messing around, so I brushed it off. The light disappeared after a few minutes. A few nights later, the light was back. This time, it was brighter and stayed on longer. I felt uneasy, but told myself it was just my imagination running wild. I'd even joked to myself that maybe the ghost of the old owner was keeping me company. Then came the night I heard the music. I was in bed, reading, when a faint tune reached my ears. It was high-pitched and eerie, like an old music box. At first, I thought it was coming from my neighbor's property on the far side of the field, but when I stepped outside to listen, it was unmistakably coming from the abandoned house. The light was on again. I stood frozen on the porch, staring across the field. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its place. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I saw movement in the window, a shadow passing by. That was the first time I felt real fear. Whoever was in there wasn't just some kid playing a prank. The movements were deliberate, slow, and deliberate, as if they knew I was watching. I locked all my doors and windows and stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and rustle. By morning, the house looked as empty as ever, the light gone. I told a coworker about it the next day, expecting them to laugh it off, but their face turned serious. "You should call the sheriff," they said. "There's been talk about squatters in the area, people who don't want to be found." I made the call, and the sheriff agreed to check it out. That evening, I saw his cruiser parked by the house as I drove home. I felt a little better knowing someone was taking it seriously. The sheriff called me later that night. "We didn't find anyone," he said, "but there were signs someone's been staying there. Candles, old blankets, some cans of food. We'll keep an eye on it." I hoped that would be the end of it, but of course it wasn't. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was outside. While I waited for the police, I stayed as quiet as possible, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The footsteps circled my house slowly, methodically. Whoever it was never tried to get in, they just lingered. When the sirens finally came, the footsteps stopped. By the time the police arrived, there was no sign of anyone. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and moved into a motel until I could find a new place. I didn't even go back for the rest of my stuff. I told the landlord he could keep it. A week after moving into the motel, I was starting to feel like I could breathe again. I'd found a temporary apartment in the city and was focused on putting the experience behind me. Still, there were nights when I'd wake up, heart racing, convinced I'd hear that eerie music or those slow, deliberate footsteps. Then, I got a call from my former landlord. "Hey," he started, his voice hesitant, "you left some stuff behind, and I was going through the cottage to clear it out. Oh, I think you should know. There was something strange." My stomach dropped. Strange how? In the crawl space under the porch, I was checking for critters before I put the place back up for rent, and I found, well, there were piles of cigarette butts, empty cans, and, oh, a blanket. Someone had been living under there. I could hardly breathe. My mind raced back to the footsteps circling my house. They hadn't been looking for a way in, they'd already been inside my space. I called the sheriff. He continued quickly. They came out and found more stuff. A notebook, some tools, a weird collection of, I don't even know how to describe it, like little trinkets, and some drawings. What kind of drawings? I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long pause. They looked like your house. And you, from different angles, like someone had been watching you. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I thanked him and hung up, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying what he said. Someone had been under my porch, watching me, following me. All those nights I thought I was alone in that quiet little cottage. I wasn't. The sheriff called me the next day to confirm they'd opened an investigation, but there wasn't much they could do. Whoever it was had disappeared. They didn't leave anything that could point to an identity, and there hadn't been any more signs of them at the old house. I tried to move on, and I really did. But then, a couple of months later, I found something in my mailbox at the new apartment. There was no return address, no postage stamp, just a plain white envelope with my name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photo. It was a picture of me sitting on the porch of the cottage, drinking tea. The angle was high, like it had been taken from the attic of the abandoned house. I called the police immediately, but of course, there was nothing they could do. No fingerprints, no leads, just the haunting reminder that someone, somewhere, had been watching me and still was. It's been a year now. I've moved 3 times since then, always choosing apartments with high security and lots of neighbors. I've changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and done everything I could to erase my digital footprint. But every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone is watching me. I check the windows, the locks, the security cameras, and I never ever sit near open windows or venture out alone at night. Months passed without incident, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. I stayed vigilant, of course, always locking my doors, staying aware of my surroundings, but life began to feel normal again. Until last week. It was a quiet evening, and I was home alone as usual. My new apartment had all the features I thought would keep me safe: keycard entry, cameras in the hallways, and neighbors on either side. I had convinced myself this was the kind of place where nothing could happen. I was watching TV when I heard a soft thump outside my door. My stomach sank immediately. It was too late for deliveries, and I wasn't expecting anyone. For a few moments, I froze, listening intently. When nothing else happened, I convinced myself it must have been a neighbor or a package being dropped off. Still, I got up to check. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing but the empty hallway. Reluctantly, I opened the door. Lying on the floor in front of my apartment was a small, wrapped package. It was brown paper tied with twine, unmarked. No address, no label, no explanation. My hand shook as I picked it up and closed the door behind me. I placed the package on the kitchen counter and stared at it for what felt like hours, debating whether to open it. Part of me wanted to throw it away immediately, but I needed to know what was inside. Finally, I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut the twine. I peeled back the paper to reveal a small wooden box, crudely carved and slightly splintered. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me sitting in my living room, taken through the window. I felt the blood drain from my face. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, with no balcony and no way to access the window from outside. Whoever took that photo had to have been inside my building, or worse, inside my apartment. I called the police immediately, choking out the details as best as I could. They arrived quickly, searched my apartment and the surrounding area, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. The officers tried to reassure me, but I could tell from their faces they were as unsettled as I was. They took the box and the photo as evidence, but without any fingerprints or identifiable marks, they admitted there wasn't much they could do. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife, listening for the slightest sound. The next day, I packed my things and left the apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not the landlord, not my friends, not even my family. I've been staying in motels, paying in cash, moving every few days. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know they're still out there, and I know they'll find me again. To whoever you are, I'm not the same scared girl you watched through the window. If we meet again, it won't end the way you expect. I live in a small, quiet town nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods. It's picturesque during the day, but at night, the place can feel different, isolated, eerie. One late November evening, I was driving home from a friend's house. It was a 40-minute drive on back roads that weave through the forest, the kind of road where your headlights are the only illumination for miles. There were no streetlights, no houses, just a seemingly endless stretch of trees and darkness. I was about halfway home when I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks saw me, but then I saw it again, movement in my backseat. It wasn't the kind of movement that screams human, it was subtle, like someone shifting slightly in their seat. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there, just an empty backseat. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to my paranoia from the creepy road. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, so I turned on the radio to fill the silence. It didn't help. Static filled the speakers, even though I had been listening to music just minutes earlier. No matter what station I tried, it was all static. As I fiddled with the radio, something caught my attention in the corner of my eye, a faint reflection in the rearview mirror. This time, it wasn't just movement, it was a shape, a figure. I froze, my heart racing. The figure was sitting directly behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the mirror, hoping I was imagining things. But it was there, a dark, shadowy outline of a person. They weren't moving, just sitting silently, almost blending into the shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by something outside. I decided not to stop or slow down. Instead, I pressed harder on the gas. The figure didn't move. It didn't react. It just was. As I neared the outskirts of the forest, the shape began to shift. Slowly, it leaned forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, or lack thereof. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing. Just an empty, dark void. At that moment, my headlights caught a deer darting across the road. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and came to a screeching halt on the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. When I finally gathered the courage to look in the backseat, it was empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing. The radio was back to normal, playing a soft rock station. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was a trick of my mind, but here's the part that still gives me chills. When I got home, I went to grab my bag from the backseat, and there it was, a single muddy handprint smeared across the middle seat. For weeks after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to brush it off as a hallucination or my imagination running wild, but the handprint, it was real. I even took a photo of it, just in case I needed proof for myself later. I showed the picture to my friend, the one I'd been visiting that night, and they looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "That's weird," they said, handing my phone back. "But, like, maybe you leaned on the seat earlier and just didn't notice." "Maybe," I said, though I knew I hadn't. The print wasn't mine. It was too big, the fingers longer and thinner than any human hand I'd ever seen. Still, I tried to move on. I avoided that forest road entirely, opting for the longer, well-lit highway route home from then on. Life returned to normal, for the most part, until about a month later. It was late December, just a few days before Christmas. I had been out running errands and stayed out later than I'd planned. By the time I headed home, it was dark, and the highway was deserted. The air was bitterly cold, and a light dusting of snow had started to fall, making the road slick. As I drove, I felt it again, that inexplicable sensation of being watched. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I resisted the urge to glance in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see anything. I couldn't see anything. Not again. But the feeling grew stronger, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I finally gave in and looked. The back seat was empty, but the reflection in the mirror showed something else, movement, this time outside the car. There was something running alongside my car. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I strained to see through the snowflakes swirling in the headlights, I realized it wasn't. It was tall and humanoid, keeping pace with my car as if it weighed nothing. It wasn't running on the road. It was moving through the trees, leaping effortlessly from one to the next, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at odd angles. Every few seconds, it would stop and turn its head toward me, as if it were making sure I was still watching. Panic surged through me, and I floored the gas. My tires skidded on the icy road, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. I didn't look at the trees again, didn't check the mirror. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, white-knuckling the wheel until I finally saw the familiar lights of my neighborhood. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, catching my breath. The house was dark. My family was out visiting relatives, but I didn't feel alone. The sensation of being watched lingered, like whatever had been with me on the road hadn't left. I stepped out of the car cautiously, glancing around the yard and the street. Everything was still. The only sound was the faint crunch of snow under my boots. But then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were massive, elongated, and clawed, leading from the driver's side of my car to the edge of the woods. They stopped abruptly at the tree line, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. In fact, I didn't sleep sleep well for weeks. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the windows set me on edge. I kept the blinds closed and avoided the woods at all costs. I never saw it again, whatever it was. But every so often, when I'm driving at night and the road is quiet, I get that feeling, that weight, that sense that I'm not alone. Months passed, and life slowly crept back toward normal. The memory of that night still lingered like a stain, but I told myself it was over. Whatever had followed me had lost interest, or at least, that's what I hoped. But then, in late spring, something happened that made me question everything. I had started going on evening walks to clear my mind. The days were getting longer, and the warmer weather made it easier to push the memories of the winter behind me. My route took me through a small park on the edge of town, a peaceful place with walking trails that wound through open fields and sparse patches of trees. It felt safe, far removed from the oppressive woods of the backroads. One evening, just before dusk, I was walking along one of the trails when I noticed something out of place. A single, muddy footprint in the middle of the path. It was large, elongated, and clawed, just like the ones I'd seen outside my car months ago. I stopped cold, my stomach dropping. I glanced around, but the trail was empty. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the silence was pressing in on me. I wanted to turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a coincidence, that my mind was playing tricks on me again. As I continued down the path, I saw more prints scattered in the dirt and weaving in and out of the trees. They seemed to circle the trail, as if whatever had made them had been watching people pass by, keeping its distance but never straying too far. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the path. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but deep down, I knew better. I was almost back to the park entrance when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a hiss. It was close, too close. I spun around, but the trail behind me was empty. The sound came again, this time from the trees to my right. I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something dark slipping between the trunks. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see them. My legs moved before my brain did, and I broke into a full sprint, running toward the safety of the streetlights and the distant hum of cars. The growl followed me, growing louder, more insistent, like it was right on my heels. When I finally reached the park entrance, I risked a glance back. The trail was empty, the trees still, but there, just at the edge of the shadows, I saw it, a shape hunched low to the ground, its limbs impossibly long, its face still that same featureless void. It didn't move, it didn't follow, it just watched as I stumbled backward onto the sidewalk, my chest heaving with terror. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to come closer. It never did. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and didn't sleep at all that night. Since then, I've stopped walking in the evenings. I've avoided the park, the back roads, anywhere even remotely isolated, but the thing is, I still feel it sometimes. When I'm home alone at night, or when I'm driving and the road gets too quiet. That weight, that pressure, that inescapable sense of being watched. I was in college at the time, and the library was my go-to spot for studying. It was an old building, 3 stories high, with creaky floors and walls lined with dusty shelves of books that no one touched anymore. My favorite spot was a tucked-away corner on the 2nd floor where I could spread out my notes in peace. One night, I stayed later than usual to cram for an exam. By 10 p.m., most of the other students had cleared out. The place was dead silent, except for the occasional groan of the old pipes. I decided to take a break and go grab some water. The library had a small break area, but the vending machines were in the basement. I'd only been to the basement once or twice before. It was mostly used for storage and old records. The lights down there were dim, buzzing fluorescent tubes that flickered every so often. As I descended the stairs, I felt a chill that made me wrap my jacket tighter around myself. When I got to the bottom, I noticed the air was heavier, like the basement hadn't been aired out in years. The vending machines were tucked in a corner, past rows of forgotten books and ancient filing cabinets. I fed my dollar into the machine and hit the button for a water bottle. As the bottle clunked into the tray, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. I was standing still. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. My heart started to race, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a janitor or another student. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my water and turned to head back up the stairs, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I passed one of the rows of shelves, I saw her. A woman was standing there, partially hidden by the shadows. She was facing away from me, her long, matted hair hanging down her back. She was wearing a pale, tattered dress that looked like it belonged in a different century. Her arms hung limp at her sides. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Was she lost? Homeless? Sick? Are you okay? quiet?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't move. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving her. When I reached the stairs, I turned and bolted up them 2 at a time. I didn't stop until I was back on the 2nd floor, where the lights seemed brighter and the air lighter. I considered calling campus security, but I didn't even know how to explain what I'd seen. There's a creepy woman in a dress standing in the basement didn't exactly sound urgent or believable. I decided to pack up my things and leave. As I headed for the exit, I passed by the front desk where the night librarian sat. I mentioned, as casually as I could, that I thought I saw someone in the basement. The librarian frowned. "No one should be down there. The basement's off limits after 8 p.m. I nodded, thanked her, and hurried out into the cool night air. I never went back to the basement after that. A few months later, I'd overheard someone else talking about seeing a strange woman down there. They described her exactly as I'd seen her: tattered dress, long hair, silent. A few weeks after the encounter, I couldn't get the memory out of my head. The image of the woman standing there, motionless, seemed to follow me wherever I went. My logical mind kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it really was someone who'd snuck in, a squatter, maybe. But there was something about the way she stood so still, so unnervingly quiet, that didn't feel human. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some digging. I figured if the basement held records, maybe it also held answers. I convinced myself it was nothing supernatural, just some quirky mystery tied to the history of the building. The library was built in the late 1800s and had been part of the campus since the beginning. Surely something interesting would pop up. I started asking the staff about the library's history, but most of them didn't know much. The only person who seemed to have any real information was the head librarian, a woman named Mrs. Calder. She was older, in her late 60s, and had worked at the library for over 30 years. When I casually mentioned the basement and the woman I'd seen, her face went pale. She gave me a long, hard look before shaking her head. "You shouldn't be going down there," she said quietly. "It's not safe. Not safe." "Why?" I pressed. Mrs. Calder hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "Years ago, back when I first started here, we used to let students use the basement for studying, but strange things kept happening. People reported seeing things, shadows, figures that weren't there when they turned around. Books would fall off shelves for no reason, and then..." She trailed off, her eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. "And then what? There was an incident," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A girl went missing. She was last seen heading into the basement. They searched for days but never found her. Eventually, the police ruled it a runaway case, but no one believed it. Not after the stories. After that, the basement was closed to the public." I felt a chill run down my spine. Did they ever figure out what happened to her? Mrs. Calder shook her head. "All I know is that she's not the only one who's gone missing around here. And if I were you, I'd stay far away from that basement." I wanted to believe she was just trying to scare me, but the look in her eyes was too genuine, too afraid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words in my head. Missing girl, shadows, figures that weren't there. Against my better judgment, I decided I needed to see for myself. If nothing else, I could convince myself it was just my imagination. The next evening, I waited until the library was nearly empty. I brought a flashlight with me just in case. When I reached the basement door, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and descended the stairs. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness, revealing rows of dusty shelves and forgotten furniture. I walked slowly, listening for any sounds. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, but as I moved deeper into the basement, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the space. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of the footsteps getting closer. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the shelves, and then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the aisle, just as before, her back to me. Only this time, she was closer, much closer. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She moved, not her bodies, but her head. It turned ever so slowly until I could see the side of her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes, were black pits staring straight through me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, up the stairs and out of the library. I didn't stop until I was back in my dorm room, shaking and gasping for breath. That was the last time I set foot in that library. A part of me wanted to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? Over the years, I've heard whispers from other students about strange things in the library, but no one ever stays long enough to find out the truth. A few years passed, and I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I graduated, moved to a different city, and started a new job. Life went on, but every now and then, I'd find myself thinking about that library and the woman in the basement. I told a few close friends about it, but they just laughed it off as a creepy college story or an overactive imagination. I almost convinced myself that they were right until something strange happened. One night, I was scrolling through social media when I came across a post post from my old university. It was an announcement that the library was undergoing renovations, including the basement. They were planning to expand it into a modern study lounge. The post included photos of the construction work, and as I stared at them, a cold sense of dread washed over me. In one of the photos, taken deep in the basement, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the background. It was faint, almost like a trick of the light, but it looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The renovations were scheduled to be completed within a few months, and the thought of people gathering in that space, laughing, studying, oblivious to what might be lingering there, made my skin crawl. About a week later, I got an email from one of my old college friends, Erica. She worked at the university now, in the alumni office, and we stayed in touch sporadically. Her message was short, but it made my blood run cold. Hey, do you remember that creepy story you told me about the library basement? Weird stuff is happening during the renovation. Workers are refusing to go back down there. They say they're hearing voices and seeing things move on their own. Thought you'd find it interesting. Let me know if you want to catch up. I didn't reply. I didn't want to talk about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the basement and the strange things Erica mentioned. Against my better judgment, I started digging for more information. I checked forums, social media, and even obscure blogs about campus legends. What I found only made things worse. There were more stories that I'd never heard while I was a student. A janitor who quit after hearing a woman's voice singing softly in the basement late at night. A professor who claimed she felt someone grab her arm when no one else was around. Students who reported seeing shadows darting between the shelves. And the most unsettling one, an old campus newspaper article from the 1970s about a seance held in the library by a group of students. The article didn't say much, but it mentioned that something went wrong. Very wrong. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that the library wasn't just haunted, it was dangerous. I wanted to warn Erica, but what could I say? That she should stay away from the basement because I had a bad feeling. She'd laugh me off. A few weeks later, I got another email from her. This time, the subject line read, "They found something." Her message was short again, but this time, it included an attachment, a blurry photo of what looked like an old wooden door, heavily padlocked, that the construction workers had uncovered behind one of the basement walls. According to Erica, no one knew it was there. The university was calling in a historical consultant to figure out what it was, but rumors were already flying around campus. Something told me that door was the source of everything. The shadows, the voices, the woman. I wanted to forget about it, to leave it all in the past, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was behind it. A week later, Erica called me. She sounded shaken. They opened the door, she said, her voice trembling. There was a room. It was small, barely big enough to stand in, but there were markings all over the walls, symbols, words in a language no one could read. And on the floor, they found, she paused, taking a shaky breath. They found bones, human bones. I didn't say anything. What could I say? They think it's connected to that missing girl, Erica continued. But I don't think it's all. There's something else, something wrong. The workers refuse to go near it now. They're saying they're seeing her, the woman you described. She's there, just standing outside the door, watching. That was the last time I spoke to Erica. The university shut down the renovations shortly after, citing structural concerns, but I know that wasn't the real reason. Whatever they uncovered in that basement, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. I've moved on with my life as best I can, but sometimes, late at night, I still think about her. The woman in the basement. I don't know who or what she was, but I know one thing for sure, some doors should never be opened. I was living in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old brick building at the time. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, and I liked that. The neighborhood was mostly families and retirees, and there wasn't much foot traffic aside from people walking their dogs or kids riding bikes. One night, I was watching TV around 10 p.m. when I heard a strange sound outside. It was faint, almost like a baby crying. At first, I thought it was just my neighbor's TV, but then it got louder and more distinct, like a cat meowing, but drawn out and I went to the window and looked down at the street. There wasn't anyone there, just the glow of the street lights and empty parked cars. The sound stopped, and I figured the cat had moved on. About an hour later, I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from right outside my door. I froze, toothpaste foam still in my mouth, and just listened. It wasn't a normal meow. It was low, guttural, and almost human-like. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no way a cat could have climbed up there, but curiosity got the better of me. I spat out the toothpaste, grabbed a flashlight, flashlight and opened the door. The hallway was empty. No cat, no person, nothing. But as soon as I stepped out, I heard it again, louder this time, like it was just around the corner. I don't know what possessed me to follow it, but I did. I walked down the hall, flashlight in hand, toward the sound. When I turned the corner, the meowing stopped abruptly, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, there was a cat, or at least, I thought it was a cat. It was pitch black, with glowing yellow eyes that didn't reflect the light from my flashlight the way they should have. It just sat there, staring at me, perfectly still. "Hey, kitty," I said softly, trying to sound calm. It didn't move. Its eyes didn't blink. I took a step closer, and the thing stood up. Not like a cat, like a person. Its front legs, or arms, I guess, stretched unnaturally long, and its back arched in a way that made my stomach turn. It didn't walk or run. It just glided toward me. I panicked and bolted back to my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart was racing as I backed away, flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard it again, the meow, but this time it was coming from inside my apartment. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and ran out of there, not stopping until I was in my car. I drove to a friend's place and stayed the night there, making up some excuse about my plumbing flooding or something. I never told her the real reason. The next day, I went back to my apartment, dreading what I might find, but everything was normal. No sign of the cat, or whatever it was. I even asked my neighbors if they'd heard anything weird the night before. They all said no. I moved out a few months later. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was some sort of weird dream. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the sound I heard was a stray cat that somehow got in. But the way it moved, I couldn't shake that. It wasn't normal. Even after I moved to a new apartment in a completely different neighborhood, I found myself jumping at little noises, scratches on the wall, wind rattling the windows, things like that. I'd always double check my locks and sleep with the light on, just in case. A few months after I moved, I started to feel normal again. No weird noises, no creepy feelings, no. Think in the hallway, life went on. I stopped telling people about it because, honestly, their skepticism made me doubt myself. But then, about 6 months ago, something happened that made it all come rushing back. I was walking home late after dinner with a friend. It was about 11 p.m. and the streets were quiet. The only sound was the faint buzz of streetlights and the occasional hum of a passing car. As I turned the corner onto my street, I heard it again, the meow. That same drawn-out, guttural sound. My stomach dropped. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe a normal cat had me paranoid. But the closer I got to my building, the louder it got. When I reached my front steps, it stopped. I froze, staring at my door, waiting for something. I don't know what. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a stray, and forced myself to go inside. My new apartment was on the second floor of a small building. No hallways, just a set of stairs leading to my door. As I climbed the stairs, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder, and there it was. The black cat was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me. Its eyes still didn't reflect light. They just glowed faintly, like embers. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I tried to tell myself to run, to get inside and lock the door, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. Then it did that horrible thing again. It stood up, its limbs stretching and bending in ways they shouldn't. It tilted its head, almost like it was amused, and took one gliding step toward me. That broke the spell. I ran up the stairs, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I just hid in the corner of my living room, clutching my phone, too scared to call anyone because I didn't want to make a sound. I sat there for hours, straining to hear anything outside, but it was silent. No footsteps, no scratching, nothing. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to peek out the window. There was no sign of the thing, just the quiet, empty street. I called out of work that day and spent it researching, trying to figure out what it could have been. I looked up stories about shadow people, cryptids, and even folklore about black cats, but nothing quite matched what I saw. Since that night, I've been carrying salt in my pocket and a small iron charm on my keychain, just in case. I don't know if they'll do anything, but they make me feel a little safer. I haven't seen it again, but I know it's not gone. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint scratching at my window or what sounds like a meow in the distance. I've tried to move on with my life, but it feels like whatever this thing is, it's not letting me. For months after that last encounter, I lived on edge. I kept my curtains drawn at all times, checked my locks multiple times before bed, and avoided walking outside at night. My friends started noticing my paranoia, and I ended up telling one of them about it. just the broad strokes, leaving out the weirder details. She laughed it off, saying I probably watched too many horror movies, but she did suggest getting a security camera for peace of mind. I liked the idea, so I bought one of those small indoor cameras that connect to your phone. I set it up at my living room, facing the window. If anything came near my apartment again, I wanted proof, or at least some warning. For weeks, nothing happened. I started to relax a little, convincing myself that whatever I'd seen was gone for good. But one night, I woke up to a notification on my phone, motion detected. My heart started pounding as I grabbed my phone and opened the app. At first, the screen was just a grainy view of my dark living room. I was about to dismiss it as a glitch when I noticed something near the window. A shadow. It was subtle, just barely visible against the curtain, but it was there, and it was moving. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The shadow shifted slowly, like it was pacing back and forth. Then it stopped, and for a second, everything was still. And then, the meow, clear as day, coming through the camera's audio. That horrible, low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The shadow on the screen seemed to swell, growing larger until it filled the entire frame. Then the feed cut out. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Call the police. What would I even say? That a shadow cat thing was stalking me. Instead, I grabbed the salt I'd been keeping, poured a line across my door and windowsills, and sat on the floor clutching my phone. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I checked the camera again. The feed was back to normal, but there was no recording of what I'd seen. Just a gap in the footage, like it had never happened. I tried to convince myself to stay, to not let this thing ruin my life. But the truth is, I was too scared. Within a week, I broke my lease, packed up, and moved in with a cousin across the state. I didn't tell her why, just that I needed a fresh start. For a while, things were quiet. I started to feel normal again, like maybe I left it behind. But last night, it happened again. I was in my cousin's backyard, letting her dog out before bed, when I heard it, that same horrible meow, echoing from the woods behind her house. The dog froze, its ears perked up, and let out a low growl. I didn't wait to see if anything occurred. I grabbed the dog and ran inside, locking the door behind me. Now, I don't know what to do. It's followed me across the state. I don't think it's going to stop. I don't think it can stop. And the worst part is, I don't know what it wants. If anyone has any idea what this could be or how to make it go away, please let me know. I'm scared it's only a matter of time before it gets inside again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. A few years ago, I worked part-time at a small boutique in our local mall. It wasn't one of those huge malls with endless corridors. It was more modest, with just a few anchor stores and a food court. My shifts often ran late, as we stayed open until 9 p.m., but I usually felt safe since the mall security was pretty diligent. One evening, I was closing the store by myself. My coworker had left earlier because she wasn't feeling well, so it was just me. As I counted the till and straightened up the displays, I noticed a man lingering just outside the glass storefront. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing there, staring through the glass. At first, I thought he might just be waiting for someone, but as I continued my closing routine, I realized he wasn't moving. He was watching me. His face was blank, expressionless in a way that sent a chill down my spine. Trying to brush it off, I locked the door and flipped off the main lights, hoping that would signal him to move on. It didn't. Instead, as I grabbed my bag and headed toward the employee exit, I saw him fall into step behind me. The mall was practically empty at this point. Most of the stores had already closed, and the few remaining employees were scattered across the sprawling layout. I quickened my pace, clutching my bag tightly. The man kept following me, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. I glanced over my shoulder, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was something off about him. His movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, and he didn't seem to blink. I ducked into a side hallway that led to the staff restrooms, hoping to lose him. After waiting a few moments, I peeked out. The hallway seemed empty, and I let out a shaky breath. I decided to head straight to the security office, just to be safe. As I turned the corner, I almost screamed. He was there, standing a few feet away, blocking my path. I hadn't heard his footsteps. He was just there. "You forgot something," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He held out his hand, but it was empty. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, backing away. His expression twisted into a grin, and he took a step closer. "You'll remember soon enough." Before I could respond, another set of footsteps approached. A mall security guard appeared at the end of the hallway, and the man immediately backed off, slinking into the shadows without another word. I ran to the guard, explaining what had happened, but by the time we returned to the hallway, the man was gone. Security reviewed the footage from the cameras, but here's the creepy part: they couldn't find him. The cameras outside my store, in the hallways, even near the staff restrooms. There was no trace of him. For a while after that night, I avoided the mall altogether. I took some time off work, and when I returned, I only worked day shifts. My manager was sympathetic when I explained what had happened, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. Things seemed to go back to normal. all. I told myself it was just a weird guy playing a creepy prank or trying to intimidate me. Maybe the cameras just glitched, or maybe security didn't look hard enough. I wanted to believe that. For a while, I almost did. Then, about a month later, I was walking to my car after a Saturday afternoon shift. The parking lot was crowded, filled with shoppers heading home for the evening. As I approached my car, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My heart sank as I unfolded it. Written in messy, jagged handwriting was a single sentence. "I told you, remember?" I froze, clutching the note in my hands, scanning the parking lot. Dozens of people were coming and going, but no one stood out. No one was watching me, or at least, not that I could tell. I called mall security and showed them the note. They checked the parking lot cameras this time, and sure enough, they caught someone on video. The footage showed a man approaching my car, slipping the note under the wiper, and walking off. The angle wasn't great, but I recognized him immediately. It was him. The way he moved on the footage was the same. That jerky, unsettling gait, like he wasn't quite in control of his limbs. But then came the worst part. The moment when he turned toward the camera, his face was pale, his eyes wide, unblinking, and even though the footage was silent, you could almost feel the weight of his grin. Security said they'd keep an eye out, but they couldn't do much without knowing who he was or what he wanted. I filed a police report, but they didn't have much to go on, either. No name, no clear motive, just a creepy guy who somehow knew where I worked and what car I drove. I stopped working at the boutique not long after that. I couldn't handle the anxiety of walking through the mall alone anymore. For months, I avoided public places altogether. I kept expecting him to show up again, outside my house, at the grocery store, anywhere. Thankfully, he never did. At least, not that I know of. I thought I was finally moving past it, until a few weeks ago. I had mostly put the experience behind me. Life had gotten back to normal. Work, friends, the occasional outing. I had convinced myself that it was over, that maybe the man had just been some unhinged stranger who moved on to someone else or gave up on whatever his creepy intentions were. But then I started noticing something. It began small. One day, I noticed my kitchen window was slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. Another time, I came home to find the throw blanket on my couch had been moved, not in a way that suggested it had just slid off, but as if someone had sat there. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I hadn't closed the window all the way, or maybe I'd just forgotten I'd moved the blanket. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. That same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was just out of sight, staring. And then, 2 nights ago, it happened again. I was watching TV in my living room, curled up with a cup of tea, when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the sliding glass door that led to my small backyard. I froze, staring at the door. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I wanted to believe it was a tree branch or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, pulling the curtain aside just a fraction. My heart dropped. There he was. He was standing just outside the glass, his face inches from the door. That same pale skin, those unblinking eyes, that sickening grin. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. "There's a man at my back door," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The operator assured me police were on their way. I glanced back at the door. He was still there, but now he was tilting his head, like he was studying me. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me, then dragged his finger across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion. I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the backyard, he was gone. The officers told me there were no footprints in the yard, which didn't make sense. It had rained earlier that evening, and the ground was still soft. They tried to reassure me, but I could tell they were just as unnerved as I was. "Val, I'm staying with a friend. I don't feel safe in my own home anymore. I don't know how he found me again, or why he's doing this. All I know is that he's not done. I keep thinking about what he said the first night we met. You forgot something, you'll remember soon enough." I used to work as a night shift janitor at an office building. It was one of those modern, glass and steel structures downtown that stayed eerily quiet after business hours. I was typically the only one in the building after 8 p.m., aside from the occasional late working executive or security guard making rounds. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude until one night made me question everything. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was finishing up on the 12th floor. This particular floor was mostly empty, save for a few offices on one end and a large conference room with glass glass walls on the other. As I was vacuuming near the elevators, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the glass doors leading to the conference room. At first, I assumed it was just my own reflection or maybe a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing just inside the conference room, staring directly at me. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing, and completely still. The glass distorted their features, so I couldn't make out a face. I froze. The building was supposed to be locked after 8 p.m., and security had already done their rounds. I turned off the vacuum, thinking maybe it was a late working employee who I hadn't noticed earlier. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing down the silent corridor. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to head toward the conference room to get a better look. As I approached, the figure moved, not toward me, but sideways, out of view, deeper into the room. My heart was pounding, but I kept walking, convincing myself it had to be a harmless explanation. When I reached the doors, I cautiously opened one and peeked inside. The room was empty. There were no other exits except the one I'd just come through. The only things in the room were a long table, a few chairs, and a projector mounted on the ceiling. I'd even checked under the table and behind the chairs, but there was no one there. I was completely freaked out, but I tried to shake it off as my imagination. I left the conference room, locked the door, and went back to cleaning. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour later, I was on the 15th floor, cleaning the kitchenette. I glanced up at the window and nearly screamed. That same figure was standing outside the glass, on the ledge, 15 stories above the ground. Their face was pressed against the window, but it wasn't a face, it was just a blank, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear the glass move, nothing, just silence. That was the last straw. I grabbed my things and left the building, leaving the rest of my shift unfinished. I told my boss I had a family emergency and couldn't work nights anymore. They didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. For months after I left the job, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it was a trick of the light or maybe stress getting to me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that night was real. The nightmares started shortly after I moved. In them, I was back in that building, walking the silent halls. The figure was always there, just out of reach, watching me through the glass. Sometimes, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd see it standing in my room. Thankfully, I never did. At least, not at first. One night, about 3 months after I left the job, I was sitting on my couch, binge watching a TV show. It was past midnight, and my apartment was dark except for the glow of the screen. I lived on the 3rd floor, and my windows faced a quiet alley. It was a peaceful place, and I'd never felt unsafe there, until I saw it again. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Something outside must have cast it, maybe a passing car or a stray cat on the fire escape. But then I realized the figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, just outside the window, staring in at me. My blood ran cold. It was the same as before, tall, featureless, and utterly silent. It didn't press its face to the glass this time, but I could feel its gaze, even without eyes. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but as soon as I turned my head to grab it, the figure was gone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was just leftover fear from that night at the office building. My mind played tricks on me. But as the days went on, strange things started happening. I'd wake up to find my apartment door unlocked, even though I was sure I bolted it before bed. My keys would go missing, only to reappear in strange places, once in the freezer, another time inside my shoe. Lights I turned off would be on when I came home, and the air in my apartment always felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. The final straw came about a week later. I'd installed blackout curtains in my bedroom to help me sleep, and they did a good job of keeping the room pitch dark. One night, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing for no apparent reason. As I blinked into the darkness, I saw it. The figure was standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just lay there, paralyzed, as it stood there, unmoving. It didn't make a sound, didn't come closer, it just watched. Finally, I managed to reach for the lamp on my bedside table. As soon as the light flooded the room, the figure was gone. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't care where I went, I just couldn't stay there anymore. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch for a few days while I figured out what to do. Eventually, I moved again, this time to a new city, far away from everything. Even after moving and putting distance between myself and those encounters, the fear lingered. The figure was gone, but its presence felt burned into my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Therapy helped to some extent. I told my therapist the sanitized version of events, just enough to sound like stress-induced paranoia without coming across as entirely unhinged. She chalked it up to trauma and recommended grounding techniques to ease my anxiety. For a while, life felt endless normal. I got a new job, made new friends, and began to settle into my routine. But the figure never really left my thoughts. It became a quiet undercurrent in my life, lurking in my subconscious conscious. I double check locks, avoid looking too long into windows at night, and always keep a light on when I slept. It was around this time that the dreams began again, only this time, they weren't confined to the old office building. In these dreams, I'd be in my new apartment or walking the streets of my new neighborhood, and the figure would be there, standing just far enough away to make me question if it was real. Sometimes it would move closer, but never quickly. It was always slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat after one of these dreams. It was 3:33 a.m. exactly. My phone buzzed on my nightstand, startling me. It was a notification, a missed call from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, trying to shake the grogginess, and then it buzzed again. Another call. The number was blocked this time. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off my phone and lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I felt relief until I saw my phone lying on the nightstand, screen cracked as though it had been slammed onto the floor. I didn't remember touching it after turning it off. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening again. Footsteps in the hall when no one was there. Objects moved from where I left them. Once, I came home to find the mirror in my bathroom shattered, with the words "we see you" scrawled in the condensation on the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I reached out to the only person I thought might understand, a former security guard from the office building. We'd exchanged numbers once in passing, and I never expected him to pick up, but he did. When I explained what I'd been experiencing, there was a long pause on the other end. Finally, he said, "You're not the first." He told me that over the years, several people have reported strange encounters in that building. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers in empty rooms, even sightings of a tall, faceless figure. Some claimed to follow them after they left, though no one had ever been able to explain why. "Do you know what it is?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's attached to you now." I didn't know what to say. He told me to try cleansing rituals, prayers, anything that might break the connection. I tried everything he suggested, burning sage, leaving bowls of salt in every room, even consulting with a spiritual medium. For a while, it seemed to work. The noises stopped, the dreams faded, and I almost convinced myself it was over. Until last night, I was walking home from work, taking a shortcut through a quiet park. The air was cool, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. I glanced around, enjoying the stillness, until I noticed something. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I froze. It was the same as before, tall, featureless, and utterly still. My breath hitched, and I fought the urge to run, knowing instinctively it would follow. Instead, I turned slowly and walked away, keeping my eyes forward. I could feel its presence behind me, closing the distance with every step. When I reached the street, I finally dared to look back. The park was empty. I don't know what it wants, or why it won't leave me alone. All I know is that it's patient, and it's always there, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And one day, I'm afraid it won't just be watching anymore. I live in a small town with a nature preserve that has a popular trail loop. It's the kind of place where people go jogging, walk their dogs, or just clear their heads. It's usually pretty busy during the day, but I decided to go later in the evening because I wanted some quiet. The trail is a 2-mile loop that winds through the woods, and at a certain point, you're completely surrounded by trees with no sight at the parking lot or the main road. That's where this encounter happened. I'd been walking for about 15 minutes when I noticed it. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me, but then I realized it had gotten completely silent. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just nothing. That's weird in itself, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. Then, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. You know that sensation when you're sure someone is watching you. It crept up on me, and no matter how much I told myself I was being paranoid, I couldn't shake it. I glanced behind me. Nothing, just the empty trail stretching back into the trees. I picked up my pace, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe I'd read too many creepy stories online. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves off to my left, deeper in the woods. I froze and scanned the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, but then a movement caught my eye. Someone, tall, wearing dark clothes, was standing about 20 feet into the trees, just watching me. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, partially obscured by the shadows. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. They didn't even flinch. I started walking again, faster this time, but I could hear the sound of leaves crunching, matching my pace. pace. Whoever they were following me but staying off the trail. At this point, I was panicking. I didn't want to outright run and make it obvious that I was scared, but I was speed walking as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. Every so often, I'd hear another crunch, always keeping pace with me. When I finally saw the break in the trees where the parking lot was, I felt a rush of relief until I glanced back one last time. The figure was standing at the edge of the trail now, completely visible. They were tall, wearing what looked like a hoodie with the hood up. I couldn't see their face. They just stood there, not moving, watching me. I ran the rest of the way to my car, fumbling with my keys and practically throwing myself inside. As I locked the doors, I glanced back at the trail. The figure was gone. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down before finally driving home. I never reported it because, honestly, what would I have said? That someone stood in the woods and creeped me out. I haven't been back to that trail since. The experience left me shaken for weeks, but I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was just some random person messing around, I told myself. It wasn't until a couple of months later that I realized how wrong I was. I was scrolling through my local community Facebook group when a post caught my eye. A woman was warning others about a strange man she had seen while jogging on the same trail. Her description was eerily similar to what I'd seen: tall, dark hoodie, staying just off the path and watching without saying a word. She said she reported it to the park rangers, but they didn't find anyone when they searched the area. That post brought everything back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a one-off encounter. I started checking the group more often, and over the next several months, similar stories started popping up. People described the same figure, always keeping their distance, always silent, and always disappearing before anyone could confront them. One post really got under my skin. A man shared that he'd been hiking the trail just before sunset when he felt someone watching him. He turned around and saw the figure just like I had, but when he shouted at them, the person started moving, running deeper into the woods. The man said he followed for a short distance but stopped when he realized how far they were going into the trees. It felt like they were trying to lure me out there, he wrote. That sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just creepy behavior anymore, it felt calculated. The breaking point for me came when a friend of mine, Sarah, told me her own story. She'd heard about my experience but brushed it off, thinking it was exaggerated. She loved the trail and refused to stop going. One evening, she decided to do the loop solo, just like I had. About halfway through, she said she felt the same eerie silence I described, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then she saw the figure not just standing off the path, but crouched low in the bushes as if trying to stay hidden. She didn't stick around to investigate. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the parking lot. The worst part, when she got to her car, there was a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. It just said, "See you soon." That was it for both of us. I convinced her to report it, and the park officials promised to look into it, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, people in our town still post about strange encounters on that trail. Some have started referring to the figure as the Trail Watcher, like some kind of local legend. After Sarah's experience, the unease in our small town grew. The park trail became less popular, especially in the evenings. But the sightings didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. The local authorities dismissed it as a prank or someone trying to scare people off, but those of us who'd encountered the figure knew better. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they operated, always just out of reach, always silent, always vanishing the moment you tried to confront them. It felt too deliberate to be a prank. Then came the incident that changed everything. A young man named Eric, who worked as a delivery driver in town, decided to take his dog for a walk on the trail late one afternoon. He wasn't the type to scare easily and laughed off the stories about the Trail Watcher. According to his girlfriend, he even joked about wanting to see what all the fuss was about. Eric didn't come home that night. His girlfriend reported him missing the next morning when she woke up and realized he hadn't returned. His car was still parked at the trailhead, but there was no sign of him or his dog. Search parties combed the woods for days. They found his dog first, tied to a tree about a mile off the trail. The poor thing was terrified but unharmed. They found Eric 2 days later. He was alive but barely conscious, lying in a shallow ditch deep in the woods. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in scratches and bruises. The search team said it looked like he'd been running blindly through the underbrush, but what was most disturbing was his state of mind. Eric wouldn't, or couldn't, say what had happened to him. He just kept muttering the same thing over and over. "It's not a man. It's not a man." He was taken to the hospital, but after a few days, his family transferred him to a mental health facility. He still hasn't spoken about what he saw, and the few times people have tried to bring it up, he gets agitated and refuses to talk. The authorities doubled down on their stance that there was nothing to fear, claiming Eric must have had some kind of psychotic break or been attacked by a wild animal. But no one bought that explanation, not after everything that had already happened. The trail is mostly abandoned now. A few brave, or foolish, people still go, usually during the busiest parts of the day. but there are no guarantees. The trail watcher doesn't have a pattern. They don't care if it's daylight or dark, busy or empty. If they decide to appear, they will. I've heard whispers about people organizing groups to go out and find whatever or whoever is behind the sightings. But honestly, I think it's a bad idea. Whatever this thing is, it isn't something you want to mess with. Eric's encounter proved that much. I've moved on from that town, but every once in a while, I check the community Facebook group to see if there are any updates. The stories keep coming, and they're getting stranger. Some people claim to hear whispers in the woods, like voices calling their names. Others report seeing multiple figures now, not just one. I don't know what's happening on that trail, and I don't want to know. All I can say is this: if you're ever in a small town with a quiet nature preserve and a 2-mile loop trail, maybe think twice before you go for a walk. And if you hear the forest go silent, or you feel eyes on you where there shouldn't be any, leave. Don't wait to see what or who is out there. There's an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of my town, a massive, crumbly relic that's been shut down for decades. Growing up, everyone heard the rumors it was haunted, used for cult rituals, or home to squatters. But the truth, no one really knew. It was a place you avoided unless you were a thrill-seeking teenager, or in my case, someone who took a dare a little too seriously. A few friends and I were hanging out one night, trading stories about local legends. Someone brought up the hospital and dared me to walk through it alone. Feeling bold, I accepted. They gave me a flashlight and waited outside while I stepped through the broken front doors. The air inside was stale and damp. Graffiti covered the walls, and debris was scattered everywhere. My flashlight flickered, illuminating peeling paint and shattered windows. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the building settling. I told myself it was fine. Nothing supernatural was going to happen. It was just an old building. But as I moved deeper, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, and I swear I heard faint whispers. I stopped and listened, but the sound faded, leaving only the pounding of my heart. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a doorway leading into what must have been an old operating room. The faint glow of moonlight streamed in through a broken window, illuminating the room just enough to see shapes inside. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. As I stepped into the room, the first thing I noticed was the gurney in the center, rusted and covered in grime. But what froze me in place was the figure standing in the far corner. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. There was someone there, hunched over, facing the wall. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, motionless. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural humming sound, almost like a chant. It wasn't coming from the figure, but seemed to echo all around me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. Before I could move, the figure shifted. Slowly, it turned its head toward me. I'll never forget the face, pale, with empty, blackened eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch too wide. The humming grew louder, and I swear the shadows in the room started to move, creeping toward me like they were alive. I ran. I didn't care about the noise I made or whether I tripped over debris. I sprinted down the hall, through the broken doors, and into the safety of the night. My friends laughed when they saw me, thinking I was just spooked by the dark, but I couldn't even speak. I just pointed to the car, and we left. I haven't been back to that hospital since. Sometimes I think about what I saw and try to convince myself it was just a squatter or a weird shadow. But deep down, I know that whatever was in that room was a human, and it wasn't alone. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone anymore. It started small, little things I chalked up to paranoia. My bedroom door, which I always closed, would be slightly ajar when I woke up. My keys, left on the kitchen counter, would somehow end up on the coffee table. It was enough to unsettle me, but not enough to convince me something was wrong. Then came the dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in that hospital, wandering its endless halls. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. In no matter which direction I went, I'd always end up back in that operating room. The figure would be there, waiting, humming that same awful tune. It would smile at me with that too wide grin, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. After a particularly bad night, I confided in my friend Rachel, the only one who seemed to take my fears seriously. She suggested I might have picked up some sort of spiritual hitchhiker and urged me to cleanse myself and my space. It sounded ridiculous, but at that point, I was desperate for anything to make it stop. Rachel brought over sage and a bundle of candles. We performed the cleansing in my apartment, her chanting some words she'd Googled while I nervously followed her instructions. For a moment, the air in my apartment felt lighter, and I thought maybe it worked. But that night, the dream changed. Instead of wandering the hospital, I found myself in my bedroom. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. The figure was standing in the corner, exactly where my dresser should have been. It didn't hum this time. It just stared at me with those empty eyes and that horrible grin. When it finally moved, it didn't lunge or attack. It simply raised a hand and pointed at me. I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking open. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My closet was empty, just clothes and shoes, but the air in the room felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called Rachel and she suggested we visit a local medium she knew. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but at this point, I had no better options. The medium, a quiet woman named Linda, listened as I explained what happened. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and asked a few questions about the hospital. When I finished, she sat in silence for a moment before saying, "You encountered something that didn't want to be found, and now it's attached to you." My stomach dropped. What do I do? Linda explained that whatever I'd seen wasn't a ghost. It was something darker, something that fed on fear. She believed it followed me because my panic during the encounter made me an easy target. She offered to perform a ritual to sever the connection, but she warned me it wouldn't be easy. The entity wouldn't want to let go. The ritual took place that evening. Linda burned herbs and drew symbols on the floor of her small shop. I sat in the center, holding a candle, while she chanted in a language I didn't recognize. As the ritual progressed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew cold, and for a brief moment, I swore I heard the humming again, faint but unmistakable. Then everything stopped. Linda opened her eyes and smiled, though she looked exhausted. "It's gone," she said, "but you need to stay away from places like that. You might not be so lucky next time." I haven't had the dream since that night, and nothing strange has happened in my apartment, but I still can't bring myself to go near the old hospital. Sometimes, when I drive past it, I feel a pull like it's calling me back. I don't know if it's curiosity or something darker, but I'll never go back inside. Not after what I saw, not after what followed me home. Life slowly returned to normal after the ritual, though I couldn't shake the lingering unease. It was like a shadow on the edge of my mind, a quiet reminder of what I'd been through. I avoided talking about it, even with Rachel, and for the most part, my friends seemed to have forgotten the whole thing. But a few months later, something happened that made my stomach drop. I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from a local urban explorer. He was known for documenting creepy, abandoned places around town, and his latest upload was titled "Inside the Old Hospital: The Truth About the Rumors." My hand shook as I clicked on it. The video started innocuously enough, shots of the graffiti-covered walls, the debris-strewn floors, and the crumbling hallways I knew all too well. But when he entered the operating room, I froze. The gurney was still there, as rusted and grimy as I remembered. The room was bathed in the same eerie light, but there was no sign of the figure. At first, the explorer panned his camera around, narrating his findings, when he paused and whispered, "What the hell is that?" The camera zoomed in on the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to move. It wasn't like the play of light through broken windows, it was deliberate, purposeful. The explorer laughed nervously, chalking it up to his imagination, and continued filming. But the shadow didn't stay in the corner. As he moved to exit the room, the shadow followed, stretching unnaturally along the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it trail behind him, disappearing whenever he turned around but reappearing when he wasn't looking. The video ended abruptly with the explorer saying, "Alright, that's enough for tonight. This place is giving me the creeps." He laughed, but his voice sounded strained. I couldn't sleep that night. The video confirmed what I already knew. Whatever I'd seen in that hospital was still there. But the worst part, the comments. One person wrote, "I've been there before and I saw something similar. Be careful, it might not stay at the hospital." Another said, "That shadow thing followed me home. Took weeks to get rid of it." My heart sank. I thought I was free of it, but now I wasn't so sure. Had the ritual worked, or had it simply hidden itself, waiting for the right moment to return? Over the next few weeks, little things started happening again. My lights would flicker even when the weather was fine. Doors that I knew I'd locked would be slightly ajar, and the dreams came back, not every night, but often enough to make me dread falling asleep. In the dreams, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. Instead, I was in my apartment, but it didn't feel like my apartment. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed alive, shifting and moving like they had minds of their own. I'd wake up in a panic, feeling watched. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint humming. My heart stopped. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been dreaming, and the noise lingered as I woke up. But deep down, I knew better. The final straw came a week later. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when I saw it in the reflection of the screen. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing behind me, its face stretched into that same awful grin. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. That was it. I packed a bag and left that night, driving to Rachel's place without even calling ahead. She let me stay, and I told her everything that had been happening. She believed me, but her face was pale as she listened. I think it's time we go back to Linda, she said. I haven't been back to my apartment since. Linda performed another cleansing, this time warning me that the entity might not be tied to a location anymore. It could be tied to me. She gave me a small talisman to wear, something she said would protect me, but her expression told me she wasn't entirely sure. It's been a year now. For the most part, things have been quiet, but every now and then, I catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, or I hear a faint hum when the house is silent. I don't know if it's my imagination or something worse. What I do know is this: some places are better left alone, and if you ever find yourself standing at the threshold of an abandoned hospital, don't go inside. You might not come out the same. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.